Hey, everybody, and welcome to Underscore. So Underscore is a monthly webinar series that we host to talk about what's going on in the world of education and to help you improve your programs, your practice, and your business. And so this month, we're talking about a very timely topic, how to develop an effective customer education strategy. So real quick, I'll just go over what we're going to talk about, and then I will let our guests introduce themselves and kind of take it away so we can get into the meat and potatoes of our conversation today. But, when we talk about developing an effective education strategy, this looks, people say strategy and you just kind of wonder, well, does that mean to you? It's just a term that people throw around, but we're not always clear on what does that mean and how do you create it. So today we're going to talk about how do you define a successful customer education strategy? What does that actually look like? How do you socialize your strategy and get buy-in, right? So not just have this documented resource, but actually who should you be talking to and what should you be saying to get the buy-in that you need to grow your education program? How to use that strategy to get budget, headcount, and investment, everybody's, favorite Christmas wish list items. And then how to execute against, I mean, I ask people, like, what do you want for Christmas? And they're like, budget. And then how to execute against that strategy, right? So, we don't want people throwing out these random, like, hey, can you make a video about X? So how do you use your strategy to kind of push back against those things? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And to kind of introduce the conversation and our special guest, I'm going to kick it over to Intellum's CXO, Greg Rose.
Hey, everybody. As the CXO, the head of advisory services and strategic consulting at Intellum, strategy is one of my favorite words, but man, is it complicated. So first off, the term strategy can conjure up different expectations for different people, especially in the world of corporate education. When you're talking to an instructional designer versus an education program manager versus an admin versus the initiative owner versus senior leadership, and especially at the C-suite level, strategy can mean different things. Ideally, we as education professionals are really good at managing both up and down, keeping everybody on the same page, but that is no easy task. I was really excited to see this topic on the Underscore series, and I'm really pleased. I was really pleased when the team asked me to host this one because I knew exactly what we would do to make this Underscore meaningful. I would call Doug, and I would convince Doug to do it with me. So just bear with me for a second. I want to give you a brief introduction. Doug Piachuk is the founder and CLO of Fresh Cognate. Fresh Cognate's an educational design and media company that focuses on education strategy, instructional design with a focus on video production. For more than 2 decades, Doug has been educating humans in some way, shape, or form. His experience is expansive. He's served as a K through 12, a higher ed, an adult education teacher, and an instructor in multiple countries. Doug speaks 4 languages. Fun fact, he was once a traveling journalist, and he led a 9,000-mile bicycling expedition from Mexico to Argentina that crossed 13 countries in Latin America. So that's what we're dealing with today. What's most important to this conversation, though, is that Doug has helped lead the development and the execution of some of the most successful online education initiatives at some pretty amazing companies like Lynda, edX, and Google. So when it's time to talk about the components of a successful education strategy and how to not only get everyone, but keep everyone aligned, you want Doug in the room. So welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it. That's quite the intro. But in all seriousness, yeah, feel free to use a chat. I'm really happy to be here. Ask questions as we go along. I want this to be as useful and instructive, and helpful for all of you as we can possibly make it.
Awesome. Well, to that point, I'm just going to jump in. So, Doug, I'm going to ask you the big open-ended question. What is a customer education strategy? And maybe more importantly, what makes a strategy successful?
This is so fun. I also love strategy after working on them for several years. So the key part of strategy that makes it successful is actually that very point, the word successful. In most places, in most if you're a brand new team to education within a company, or kind of at any point, defining what success is really the biggest challenge for you. And that has a lot to do with, obviously both your audience is really important, but also what everyone else in your company thinks is success as well. And so my advice here is to take this part extremely seriously. I think also think of it as a relationship building exercise. The closer you get to both your audience and all of your stakeholders, the closer you might get to documenting it. And then I also would say, try to be very, very deliberate and explicit about what it is and what it isn't, and make it very small if you can, especially if you're starting. What I'm thinking is, if you're starting an educational initiative in the company, the best thing you can possibly do is to try to whittle down what you're focusing on to a small list. What I tend to find teams to do is they tend to, and I get this, there's always pressures in education. As soon as you mention it, everyone wants a different course about a different thing. And then that can often make our whole offering seem like a potpourri of lots of different stuff. As best you can, whittling it down and focusing on just a few initiatives, and then getting extremely clear about what success looks like and coming up with measurements to how you can then define what that success is. So at the end of the year, you can actually step back and say, like, I don't need to necessarily, put out some amazing speech or send bottles of wine to all my senior execs. Actually, we can just step back and look at data that we all agreed on at the beginning of the year would tell us some of the story of what success looks like or doesn't. And then, of course, I think one of the assumptions I always make here is then, of course, do a really good job of your work, and then the metrics will be there. And I will say this, in all of my different stops in educational teams, data has always been really awesome. Even when something doesn't turn out quite how we would think, the conversation often illuminates, a lot of different stuff that does come up. And when you get into measurement in the first place, there's always kind of unexpected. If you might have a failure in one of your major success pieces, or one of the things you're really looking at, there's often, if you look further into the data, some other clues about maybe why that happened, and then also other initiatives that you might be able to do in the future that will be more successful. So always measurement focused. So the three groups that I think you should look into in terms of relationships, one is obviously your customers. So if that's your salespeople, or if you have internal salespeople who are selling some of this stuff to people, or if it's direct to your customers, it's getting really close to those people. And by getting close, I don't just mean doing UXD studies on figuring out how those people and coming up with personas, and I mean, that's all fantastic. But I mean actually talking directly with these folks and seeing, what they need, and seeing, to what extent they might even be willing to work with your educational team. One of I think the really, really big assets that we have in learning, especially the corporate level, is a lot of people who are doing the jobs that we're sort of training people on are often quite helpful, or even have their own resources that can help the wider community, especially the experts of them. And so one of the things that I often work with clients on is locating those audiences and figuring out how can we work with our own audience to potentially have them help us develop curriculum. How can we make them advisors to newer people, further up the funnel for us, newer customers, et cetera. And that creates buy-in across all the levels. And it also helps make sure that our content is super relevant. That can include, by the way, finding stakeholders within our own company who might want to be curriculum experts on some of the stuff that we're delivering. Again, the more sort of folks you can work with to both create the curriculum, the more buy-in you're going to get. And that's super critical to making sure it matches and is going to be impactful. Another piece you're going to want to get really, really clear with right off the bat is who your leadership is, and not necessarily keeping yourself just to your immediate leadership, but actually looking at leadership across the team, educational or across your entire company. Education is a cross-cutting initiative. It tends to be less vertical than a lot of things done in companies, and you'd be surprised at how relevant it will be, especially if you look broadly to your whole company. A lot of us might focus on external education first. I've done internal programs that then launched into external programs, and vice versa. There's an awful lot of overlap between what you'll do in education and what other teams might want to do at your company. And talking to leadership broadly can be a really great first start there. You also might be surprised at who will be your ally in education. I will say, like, talking to people about the value of education, a really good way to start to piece out who, might be the people who are going to really help share your message, and those who might, be people who need a little bit more convincing over the time. Finally, let me just push this out there, just because in my last tenure, I was a product manager. Before that, I was doing all this educational stuff. And I think a lot of us might, and especially if you're working in a tech company, which I'm particularly familiar with, product teams do an awful lot of things within product teams that look like education. We often have our own teams that do, feedback and QA with our clients and customers and et cetera. But it's rare that you see a product team partnering directly with an educational team internally. I think there's a lot of advantages to that. And I think a lot of product managers might be really surprised. You might be surprised at the number of product managers, I think, who are open-minded, who will be, because for instance, when you're working on a product, such Intellum, for instance, is here, they have an educational product. They want people to use the tool as best they possibly can, but that's not the sort of thing you can only bake that into the tool to a certain degree. Where education comes in is then actually really helping advise and leverage the tool to its best capabilities. And when a product team all of a sudden has an ally in education, they realize like, oh, wow, we can start to help our learners actually understand how to utilize this tool in the best ways. Then that's going to improve, of course, their data. It's also going to improve retention of customers. All of these sort of things go up across the board. And it's a tool that I think a lot of us in tech don't often think of, because a lot of times we do just release the product to the wild and we sort of go, let's see what happens. There is a really neat space there to start to work directly with educational teams, who also might provide a client space as well for people to have more broader discussions about the positives and drawbacks of the tool as well. Yeah,
That's great. That's an awesome answer. So it gets me actually thinking about the next question, which is, when I think about the most successful, especially the most successful customer education initiatives, including one that you and I have worked on together, they all seem to have one thing in common. And that commonality is that the person who owns the education strategy can clearly tie education initiative to real business results, real outcomes like revenue or retention or cost reduction. How do you go about building business goals like that into the education strategy?
Yeah, fantastic. I think that again, that's like a perfect piggyback up of where we just were, which is like a lot of this is built on those relationships, right? And oftentimes, for instance, if I'm going to have, like what we're saying here is, it's good to have 2 to 3 business objectives. You want to keep it super high level for executives to understand what it is. And oftentimes I want to make sure that those objectives are written in such a way that it literally might even be the words of the leader for whom that objective is important coming out in the objective, right? So much of this is about buy-in and building support and helping people see their own kind of things happening through education as a vehicle, right? Yeah, Pam was just saying there's a lot of surprising aspects in which education across companies. And so, yeah. So business outcomes, we actually have a sheet later in this presentation where we'll show this, but when I think about the 2 or 3 business outcomes, I will usually be thinking about every outcome, which leadership member is it particularly targeting? Like, I want to try to broadly, ideally, obviously, you want to have coverage, but then you also want to have depth with the leaders who matter, where those things are being drawn. You also then want to tie. This is very much like being a teacher and having learning objectives in your classroom, is you want to connect your learning objectives to the state standards. In this case, you want to connect all of your learning and measuring to your business objectives, right? And so hopefully every single one of your outcomes is connected directly to another business outcome, and just how you're leveraging education then to move forward this new outcome in 2024 that the business is really fascinated with. So again, there's like the tied to leader, tied to business outcomes, such as retention, net promoter score, et cetera. And then you talk about the measurement of it, and you talk about how you're going to construct it to get as close to that as possible. And I think a lot of this, the way that we sort of talk about this education, is turning education from a cost center, a place where the business has to spend money on it, to a place that actually makes money. And this is surprisingly possible, and not even that complicated, I would say. I mean, when it comes to attribution of dollars and cents from education itself, what we're looking for in education is outcomes of education that lead to behavioral change, that lead to the end user doing something different. And for instance, in a lot of tech companies will use or create newer tools, such as when I was at Google, I was working with our advertising teams. Google has thousands of little advertising tools to use, but there's always newer ones coming out. Turns out that if customers are using the newest tools, one, the customers tend to perform better, which is great for them. And two, that tends to do really well for Google as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we actually looked at Google was we went, okay, cool. To what extent do our educational initiatives helping our end users start to leverage these aspects of the tools? And that was all measurable stuff. And one of the reasons that I've moved from a lot of public education to corporate education is that I absolutely love the depth of measurement that you can get. We're restricted to do this in education, public education, for a lot of really good reasons. But for us in corporate education, we can actually get really hard data about how we are performing. And so, for instance, with this example at Google, one of the things we could look at is we could go, hey, we launched this new initiative, new tools, working really well across America, Latin America, but for some reason in Eastern Europe, this is actually a true example. There's some tool that for whatever reason in Eastern Europe wasn't being leveraged particularly well. So then we developed specific training on it. We already had the training basically, but we kind of customized it to that audience and then special delivered it to that audience and then looked at the difference over time. And now if you can get to that and you can show that you had that over that time, there's a 20% bump, in people leveraging this tool more. Now, not 100% of it can you say that was your educational effort. There's so many different things that you can attribute to that. But if it is a bump that's reasonable, which is hard not, at least in the interventions that I've done, it's hard not to get, then that goes pretty directly to dollars and cents. The other thing that I like to look for within companies is a lot of times companies know certain things about their customers. Like if a customer starts to use this part of the tool, or if it starts to leverage this aspect, we know that that customer is likely to spend X much more. And those are the sorts of business things that we can really try to tie in to our educational plans to bring customers to those places that we already know are places that can drive, further traffic, further engagement, and greater success over time. So, and then finally, I think that this piece that I was kind of bringing up before is we can actually in education take some of the folks who are already really successful and start to kind of see how they might work with us to bring more success to other people who are new to the platform. I think there's a lot of really neat opportunities with that socially. And also in terms of people's profile, there's a lot of kind of win-win situations that you can build in terms of having people closer to your company, also helping other customers. Yeah.
Getting from learning outcomes to business outcomes can be really hard. One thought though is doing that work up front or doing the work now, even when it feels hard to sort of get the data you need from other departments, other function areas. So transitioning from cost center more towards profit driver, even if you can't yet correlate, clearly the sort of consumption of content to the hard business outcome is maybe the answer to the budget question. So, I think it's hard sometimes to sort of go from zero to clear, tying the data directly to the impact on something like revenue. But even if you can just benefit or start to demonstrate the correlation, I think that's where things like more budget come from and greater visibility in the org.
Right. Yeah. And I think our learning outcomes are often going to be focused on, learning how a tool works, the specifics of that. The business is then, once you do know that, what do you do with that? But they're really nicely intrinsically related. And I think as well, just as an educational nerd, one of the things that's really nice about spending an extra time, I would say, on outcomes and measurement is that we also get, as designers, as people making these trainings, we get a lot of direct feedback then on the quality of the work that we're doing, which is incredibly helpful. So when we take experiments, when we try to innovate in learning, we can sometimes get really direct feedback. And if you do have a global audience, in that example that I was bringing up before, where you might have Eastern Europe struggling at this, you can start to think about A/B testing different, educational strategies across different audiences for the same problem across the world. And that's super fun stuff to get into. So that's what makes me get excited about spending so much more time in measurement, In the educational world, this is often seen as like, backwards design lesson planning, or just making sure that our objectives are first. I think business has the same standards. We're going to make our business outcomes first. And then once we know what the end goal is, then we can all figure out how to get there.
That's awesome. Which actually is a great segue into the next question. So I imagine that you are the decision maker. So you're in charge, and an initiative owner is coming to you, and they are seeking approval for a plan and a budget for education in 2024. What do you expect to see? What do you expect to see from that owner in terms of the components of the strategy or what's in the strategy? Like tell us what that should look like.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the strategy itself, this is a first bit. Strategy should be actually relatively brief, right? If you're talking to executives, it's quite brief. A lot of the stuff that you might actually spend the majority of your time, especially with your team, talking about, might only mostly end up in the appendix, which is the like how you're going to do all of this, how the learning objectives are going to connect to the question banks and the pools and all that. And which, by the way, like can talk about that another time. Super passionate about all of the like how do we wire this up properly. But in terms of like the executive presentation, again, short and sweet. So really, really punchy objectives. If there's something that feels like a half objective or something that's like a not as big a push, I would suggest either like cutting it out or just having it in the speaking notes. So you can make this as short as possible. And what I like to see is from a business outcome is essentially one, we want to see that as why it's important to the business, which again, if you can connect that to direct leadership, if you can connect that to objectives that the company already has for the coming year, amazing. Then you've kind of got that like, why are we doing this at all, right? Then we want to get really, really clear about how we're going to measure it. And this is the space where I think you can really spend time with leadership and engage them about this is how we think we're going to measure it. Is this good? Do you have better ways of measuring this? Like essentially what we want to do is wire this whole thing up so that again, at the end of the year, I don't have to do a lot of magic to see whether or not we had success. We actually should be able to go right back to this presentation and go, okay, cool. Now we have the numbers. Let's see how we did. And this is where I think leadership will often have insight potentially into, sort of different things we might be able to measure, as well as more insight into certain like thresholds we might want to meet with customers that they know to be successful in terms of driving impact. So the what exactly we're measuring, feeling good about that. And then I will usually pause once we've got like, here's the objectives. We all know why these are important. Awesome. I've hopefully got a few leaders who I've already shared this deck with numerous times. And so they're in this meeting going, oh yeah, objective one, this is why I'm behind it, et cetera, et cetera. And then with the outcomes, I just say, hey, let's all just then, once we've finished talking about it, let's stack hands and say, this is good. We all agree with this. Maybe we'll add this or, a few things to these few objectives, but then we're done. And then we're like, cool. All of the stuff that you think about in your educational land, as incredibly important it is, that's our domain of expertise. And it's not something that we necessarily need to, I think what we can do is we can show that we're like more than happy to talk about that. We can add an appendix full of all the how we're going to do that, but that tends not to be the thing that's going to be a major focus. Yeah, I think you want to keep out of the non-specific content deliverables and includes technology and delivery components. And then you want to kind of talk about, again, what does success look like? Are we clear about it? And then what do we want to get from this year? You'll find some leadership really will want to get directly to revenue if they can, right off the bat. And then you'll find others that aren't going to push for that right away. And I think good to, again, just kind of take their lead in terms of where this goes. I think when when it comes down to actually getting the hard science of creating money from this, I think the road is there. But direct attribution from this is when you get into the weeds, it's fairly complicated. And so I think it's good it's absolutely excellent to start out measuring as much as you possibly can and being very intentional about it. When you start to claim the success, I think that's something you want to be a little more careful about.
That's interesting. Well, I think we're going to go through an example actually of doing this, dive in a little deeper. So I'll let you keep going.
Cool. Yeah. So we drafted this slide just quickly to kind of give you a sense of what that might look like. And again, this should hopefully demonstrate the brevity. I'll just say there's an assumption here. Getting down to 3 objectives, which we have here, that's going to be really hard. 3 initiatives. That's hard. That's really, really hard. but it's doable. And that's a piece where hopefully you can work directly with your leadership and help them understand the importance of focusing on really getting to things that we can know we can be successful in measuring that versus trying to boil the ocean. So in this example, we have a company that's doing a new certification. So they're starting to leverage certification. Certification strategies have been really successful for companies. We had a lot of success at Google with those over time. It's really neat that people are starting to share these things on LinkedIn, et cetera, major social components to it. So for this, for instance, we're saying, we'll do new certification targeted on new customers. So this is sort of an onboarding initiative that, again, hopefully, for this imaginary company, they're finding that earlier in the funnel in their onboarding journey, they're having, they're not seeing quite the success rate that they used to. And maybe there's greater competition. So this is a really great opportunity for learning to come in and see what it can do. When we get to measurement, this is the where hopefully it makes sense, right? So we would like to see a higher percentage of new customers retain or interested in it. And this is something that, in a year-over-year analysis, hopefully by the end of the year, we really start to see that data bump. Of course, again, directly attributing only to education is going to be complicated, but education should totally make a difference in this if done well. We also then can look at tool adoption across these customers, especially new customers. Really fascinating to see what levels of the tools will they engage with, and are they able to get to some of the deeper methods that might even prove more successful. That's also something that you can think about when developing a curriculum itself, is like which places of the tool do you want to get people to the fastest. And so you hopefully can then see that reflected in the data that's coming from your customers as well. And then in this case, I made up this idea that we would then have like potential direct advisors that a new customer might talk to help them get deeper into the tool. This might actually just be another expert very much similar to them, who's just another part of your audience that's helping them in a sort of pro bono sense. Or it might actually be somebody who you're paying, who's on your payroll to kind of help them through this. This is the place where if I were doing this live with a company, I would expect that they might have a few more pieces of measurement to look at specifically, depending on what their scenario is. But again, this is hopefully something where at the end of it, you can go, okay, cool. So our leader is Meg Snow. Meg Snow is going to talk all about this initiative, why it's important to the company. And she can also help us make sure this measurement makes sense. Do we all feel good about these measurement points? Are these everything we need to know? Or is there something else we should be looking for? And that's where sometimes I can have an appendix with these of like, here's all the other things we're going to measure. Because I would definitely say, like, in terms of measurement, turn on everything you can to measure in the first place, but then call out the ones that to be the most important, that you're definitely going to report on. So again, this is a sort of a scorecard across the business. And we did this with two other. So the next one is just let's say like a mobile part of the business is new, some kind of mobile aspect to the tool. So then maybe training around that. And then finally, a third one to kind of balance the onboarding bit is we have some kind of advanced customer success training, where we're also looking at retention, and use of the tool for people who are more advanced users. These often complement each other particularly well. And actually the work that you do with advanced users can often help a lot with new certifications, again, if you leverage that audience. So again, then hopefully you see measurements that are really interesting with this. And then let me just kind of say this, like now once this is explicit, if this is your strategy, this is also your scoreboard. And I think it's kind of neat to, so something we used to do way back when at lynda.com was we actually had a scoreboard of all of the courses that were in production, all the ones coming. It's nice to kind of list this stuff on the wall for people to see and to track over the year. Now, maybe not like, I know business stuff is not necessarily the thing that learning designers might want to think about all the time, but it's not that far. It's kind of fun, I think, potentially. And so these are things that you might, one thing I want to say is like all the work that comes into boiling this down into something that is valuable, try to leverage that and try to keep it a visible part of your team going forward. I think that's going to be really important in terms of developing partnerships across the business and continuing to get more people to realize what an avenue education can be to advance whatever other initiatives that might be out there. So at the very bottom, I'll just touch on this really quickly. Again, this is a place where we can say, hey, we're focusing on 3 here. Maybe we might be doing a little bit more on this, or at the very least, we can say, hey, we know that there's like 6 other initiatives that people are really clamoring about. This is a place to document those and to say they're totally on our radar. And again, this is one of those places early on where you can hint at like, if you want to bring up funding or these sorts of conversations early on, it can sort of suggest at that. But I think it's really nice to say, hey, look, there's a there's a difference between what we're going to full on work on and then these other things, but at least we're going to acknowledge that these other things are in the funnel. Future partnerships, I think, are super critical too, because I think once we see success, this is what I often see happen in large corporations is there's usually quite a few different learning teams. When it comes to those that are successful, that's a much smaller number of learning teams. And the learning teams that I see that tend to be the most successful are the ones that are most deeply connected across the organization, the strongest relationships, who are helping other teams start to see how they might use your education to also further advance whatever initiatives they have. So I think the reason I want to kind of put this out there is these are conversations that I think, like, when you think of other teams adjacent to yours, open those conversations early. So it might be 2 or 3 years before you actually activate that. But knowing that there's already that sort of buy-in, again, from a leadership perspective, is really neat to see, is to go, okay, cool. And then here, this gets, I think, to really break down the background behind this. From a real nuts and bolts conversation business-wise, this should be really clear to an executive, to anyone, about what decisions to make about this learning team going forward, right? Here's a scoreboard for how my team performed. Hopefully we see it perform really well. If it does, sort of what do we do about that? And I think all of that is here and it's pretty succinct. Then, under the fold, for those leaders who want to get into it, that's where you can really, espouse all the different values and things you're going to be talking about and how you're going to be moving these metrics up, which of course is a major assumption in this presentation, but we're always going to move into those metrics up. And I think that's where you want to partner with experts, or hopefully your team has these really innovative people who are going to think of all the different ways that we can design our programs so that these metrics are actually something of an afterthought. Not an afterthought, but there's something we know that we're going to get to. And we can then just be going like, how do we get even more points on the scoreboard over the course of the year? And how can we make this kind of fun?
That's awesome. Well, and this is such a great example. Again, a nice segue into the next question. It's something you mentioned a few minutes ago that I think is important, especially as education evolves and the strategies and the types of content that we present are evolving. We see those internal teams, other education teams aren't just education teams. We see that kind of content being produced and deployed out of teams that don't self-identify as educators. Some of it's coming from marketing, some's coming from sales, some could come from the product team, And so one thing I've heard from multiple clients recently, there's this sort of consistent term. They start to talk about the fact that socializing their strategy is something they're doing much earlier in the process of building the strategy.
Yep.
And so I want to open that question up, see if you subscribe to this theory and how you think about socializing the concept and when in the cycle you do it.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is also the same thing I see for teams that are having success. You don't just think about the launches of courses or initiatives as a time to be talking to people. It's actually an all year, all the time thing. And actually, especially if you're a new team, you're doing it an awful lot before you even launch anything at all. So yeah, strong believer in that. Also a strong believer that if you get your strategy really tight, it is bought in by executives. That's the sort of first thing as a business card or calling card around the business that you can also just bring around to you with these conversations too. Like when people are like, what are you going to be working on? Here's what it is. And then, that's exactly where you can start to advance the slide in terms of what our future partnerships might be, et cetera, et cetera. And I think as transparent as these sort of docs can be about like, this is our direction, as more widely adopted or seen that they are, the better. Yeah. And then I think one of the things that's kind of really fascinating that also I think comes out of education a lot of times, and I think it's really, this, by the way, I also think is just a huge advancement that's coming in the next phase of like improving corporate education, is really, really leveraging social with your audiences, with your partners, all of that. Because I think that we often find that actually within an educational space, the quality of dialogue can go up quite a bit, much more than what we would expect to see on the internet in general. A lot of us, I think, are clouded by a lot of the random sort of discussions that we might see on X or on Instagram, et cetera, or YouTube. When you actually do this within an educational space, I think there's a ton of opportunity to then kind of be flipping your organization to thinking not only as education of like, what kind of things can we create for our audience, but also what kind of things can our audience share with us that we can then promote, which is even easier right? And that's where you're starting to see your own customers as like, hey, we can help them be successful, and we'll also continue to be successful. And actually, good, we just gave our instructional designer a little bit of time off to work on something more important, perhaps. So yeah, so socializing this throughout the calendar year, really important. Making up things outside of your product launch is also going to be really critical, and especially doing this with leadership and thinking of your leadership over a long-term basis. I was mentioning this to Greg and Shannon the other day, but I think this helps me a little bit. I have a background once upon a time as a social worker, and one of the things that social workers do is they will actually take each major relationship that they might have for success in their life. You can do this in your personal life too, by the way. Same applies, but you can look at your relationships with people, and you can grade them on like a 5-point scale. A 5 is somebody who can finish your sentences for you, and so is a major ally. And a 0, obviously, is someone who's going to be kind of maybe contesting most of the things that are sort of coming out. What I like about that is it's not something to take. It's not something to use and take relationships as like a platform for complaining. It's actually rather to just see how over time you can start to move those numbers more up, right? And so you're absolutely, if you're going to walk in education in any company, you should expect to have leadership or other people be around you to start at a 0 or a 1 or a 2, of how you think about it. And that's totally fine. Again, if you can give it a good number and you're like, great, that's where they are. But then over time, you can start to see those advance. And I think the other nice piece about it is that you can also know, where your big hitters are, who can also help you, advance your causes in education too. So that's a nice little piece, I think, when you think about stakeholder management. And so again, I think that's the reason why I say 20% as well. We kind of put this out there is that I think oftentimes as product people, we think let's spend 100% of our time getting to our customers the best so we can deliver the best education for them. Which, by the way, I'm not fighting that at all. I'm just saying that we, in addition to doing that, we really, really do have to give some really good time and credence to talking to some other people around the organization. Education and how it works, especially within tech companies, is still something that's rather new to people. I have to say, we saw a huge revolution in how education was leveraged at Google over the last 10 years. Before that, Google was not an organization that really did an awful lot with education because it was really product focused. It was like, we put a thing out, we see how it goes. It wasn't until recently that they started to realize lots of opportunities here, and how that can actually even help our products be adopted further. So yeah, cross-functional collaboration, I think we touched on that. And then finding your advocates. So that whole social work chart, I would highly advise you to kind of have that, and to also put that as an OKR for yourself, maybe, or a personal objective. A thing that you might measure yourself on is where those engagements, where those relationships look like over the course of a year and longer.
And just quickly, I want to ask you one more question here before we go on, in just 1 minute. But there are opportunities as we do this to identify places where that other education lives, and maybe it's small initiatives, it's an overlapping initiative. Like, how do you pull those people in? When you're looking for advocates, you're addressing stakeholders. Maybe there's an opportunity to to build a partnership. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think this is one why we put it very transparent about this is what we're going to be working on. And then when those opportunities come up, I think oftentimes we might be scared of them, right, as a competitor. So the very first thing I think of is like, oh, great, you think this is important too. And then it's how we can frame the conversation around that. And then there I can say, hey, look, this is what we're planning to do in this space. But also, I didn't maybe know that you were doing this, or maybe I did, but how can these how can we link these, right? Like, if we're both going to be doing this, essentially, how can we make it more of a success? And I think there's often a lot of opportunity in that space. Again, education doesn't necessarily have to fall into the same dynamics as might happen into another place within a company. It really often is that rising the ship for all boats works well. Some people might not always have that thought in their head, but at least in my experience, that's always been the case.
That's awesome. All right, thanks for that. So, all right, I want to now come full circle, kind of all the way back to where we started. So let's say we have our strategy. It's awesome. We've gone through this process. We've socialized. Now the rubber hits the road. How do you leverage this strategy you're building to actually go back and do things like secure budget, secure headcount, which right now seems impossible, to get more buy-in and additional investment in all of its different forms from the organization and from leadership.
Yeah, awesome. So I think now that you develop this scorecard of like how your team is going to perform, you might also get a little bit afraid that you go like, hey, look, I've also just given my superiors a really good note of why I'm going to end up leaving this company in a year. And so there is an awful lot of things that we can do to get ahead of that. And one of those is that, when we are going to, for instance, start to measure objectives and metrics, I liked so again, you'll start to notice this from me. I like to cut bigger things down into smaller initiatives. And so, for instance, if we're going to launch a huge initiative, why not launch aspects of it first? Why not have a small launch, a pilot launch for a smaller audience? In other words, like in terms of the gathering these data bits that we're looking at, the data, what we don't want to do is just the day that we have to show this to leadership be the day that that data comes out.
Yeah.
We're like, here's the score. I mean, that'd be fun in a way, but maybe not the best for your success at a company.
Yeah.
And so as much as you can actually start to hint at these things early, get ahead of them and do a pre-pilot, do something really similar but smaller in the beginning of the year to kind of test it out, test the waters, see how the data moves, see how people react, the better. Because then when it does come to then asking for budget count, head count, again, I think that this is where your strategy document puts you in an excellent position. We say, like, with the current resources we had, we're able to focus on these sorts of things. You can even break down the success then based on the metrics. Like, hey, we gave this team, an especially higher percentage of our resources, and this is how it performed, right? Because I think oftentimes, for instance, like any initiative we run, we always wish it were better funded, right? The ones that we've already agreed on. And then, of course, we're always looking for money and headcount for all the other initiatives we're being asked of. And so this is two, I'd lean on your document, but then two, the other part of this is I would lean very heavily on these leadership stakeholders that you have, right? One, if you have great success in year one and you do satisfy these initiatives, which you will, let's not take a bunch of money towards new initiatives and then somehow kill the success that we already had, right? So I think this is where leadership support can help you, vouch for ongoing support mechanisms needed to keep your current initiatives already floating. And then also thinking about intelligently, again, whittling down what is the most important thing for the business going forward and trying to keep that list small, but really intelligent going forward. And where are the greatest risks or opportunities that we sort of see in the future? And how do we make sure that we fund those? So those can be bigger buckets to both expanding our in-team or expanding our impact. I guess I'll say this too. I often think of educational, how to make great courses, how to make great content, both online and in person or hybrid. That's a center of excellence. A lot of times for large companies, I see hundreds of these, actually, in some cases, hundreds of different learning teams, and that's fine. But I actually think there's I think oftentimes there's a lot of opportunity to combine those teams from a leadership perspective, and those are conversations that I think you want to be careful about from a leadership perspective, but maybe not a shy away from. Which is that if you can really start to, for instance, prove that you make really great impact on the metrics that you have, it's like how then might you partner with other teams that have different initiatives to start to leverage similar aspects, similar tools, similar production methods, strategies, etc. So it's more of an open book about how your company starts about thinking about it. Again, education is this place where I think we can raise all the boats kind of collectively. And so I think this is one of those really big, this is again why if you're measuring it really closely, if you're showing how you're making that impact, then hopefully your team becomes a team that's known for driving impact on what it's known for, which in other words, like then that if there is funding is definitely going to look like a team that's good to fund, right?
Yeah. The brand of your team, right, has
right.
increased and you look like something that should be funded.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I say that all because I think I don't exist out in a vacuum. I am here in 2023 when, in general, I think we've seen, depending on where you are, but most pretty large scale, you've seen a lot of budgets kind of go from like we're going to go as small as we can because it's COVID. Oh wait, now we're somehow going to make it even smaller. So, so I think that sort of like head to impact value again, not sort of the way that you want to think about things in general in life, but I think that's the thing that you can get ahead of. And I think maybe these sorts of things that you might be anathema to you in learning are actually like worth embracing so that you can actually get ahead of them and not allow them to be bad things, if you will. Yeah. And that's where understanding your metrics, understanding the measurables, all of that stuff. If you get really passionate about it, it's fun. And yeah, you could learn a lot. And I think that that's the piece that gets me excited about all this stuff over time, is like really, really fascinating to actually see if we can get humans to do things a little bit differently in their life, and if that does improve their life. So
that's great. So I'm gonna ask one more question, and I think Shannon's gonna open it up for Q&A. And with this question, I want to go really down into the weeds, because I have this sort of anxiety when I'm launching or helping launch something new, especially. It's like, we've gone through all this great work, we've taken your advice, we've built this really solid strategy, we've got stakeholder alignment, we're ready, we feel good, we launch. It's inevitable that we're going to get this onslaught of these like one-off requests, and these are like distractions at best, they're progress killers at worst. How do you defend and push back against these gremlins?
that is such a good question. And I'll have to admit that one of my career stops, I really struggled with that.
Yeah.
So that's a question I've thought about a lot, because it can be, success is a product of, further challenges in some respects. This is certainly one of them. Again, I think, again, this is where relationships, I'll say this as many times as I can during this presentation, but like leaning on relationships you already have with leadership is going to help you block, to some extent, your funnel. I do think actually, so I come to education as both somebody who was a computer scientist and a poet and teacher. And so actually the world of like product management. So what I'm kind of leaning on a product management lens to this, which is that you capture all these requests and you have it in a place that you reflect them to your audience. So it's like, hey, first of all, here's all the requests we have, which first of all should demonstrate, wow, there's a lot of them. And that team is of a certain size. And then prioritize them, in terms of where they fit, and lean on leadership to help you, create those categories of where to prioritize them. And essentially, often then this does come directly down into like, hey, if you think this is really important, we've actually done this within companies in certain spaces, is say, look, for our team, this is a P whatever, which is like, this is that level of priority. So this is for our team. Unfortunately, this is not a super high priority. You're right that there's maybe some people in Russia who would really like to access this course from a localization perspective. We haven't done that from the get-go. We don't really have the budget, and it's not really behind any of our deliverables in the business. But if you have that, first of all, if you have that reflected, like, I heard you, which is important, here's where we have it. Then the other thing that you can do is say, hey, look, we're probably not going to do this because it just doesn't fit on a roadmap, unfortunately. What you can do, though, is if you really need this to happen, is you can find money yourself, or you can find folks who can help us with this. And then that actually is a thing that we can serve. Like, we don't want to not serve you in these requests, but we need to make sure that whatever is in our queue, fits our own priorities. And so if it's outside of that, we'll let you know as soon as possible. And then we'll have this honest conversation about, like, if that's a thing you need, let's figure out how within the business you might be able to make that happen, which then, in many cases can be just lending some extra resources to this team to go, okay, cool. So you've given us 2 heads for a quarter, that should be able to do it, and it's like, all right, great, cool. Wasn't a huge priority for us, but now we'll have it. Not a bad to have by any means. So I think that's the quick and dirty on how I would do it. And then of course I would say, foresight is key. So if, before your launch, if you can mention this to leadership that these sorts of things are going to be coming, it's also just a good heads up so that leaders can kind of be ready for that. Like, within their organizations, they might have some really vocal leaders who are going to be like, hey, that was great, now I need 25 of them. Yeah, that happens. And that's a really good thing. So again, yeah. So like treating them in that sort of way, and, as best as possible, and being really delighted, even though behind the scenes you might be like, gosh, this is a lot, and then again, trying to flip these conversations so they're not just them banging against your door, but actually one in which they might be able to help open the door, I think is about as best we can often do.
There's something in there that you said that I think is so great. I love this idea of sort of education adopting the kind of approach that a product manager takes, thinking of themselves as product managers. Like, that's fairly unique, and I love that about your background, something we've talked a lot about, and it's like very inspiring as we think about our education roadmap for the year. and what we're releasing against that roadmap. The idea that, when we make changes to the roadmap, it has an effect. That we have audiences, we have customers, we have internal stakeholders, we have extra.
Yeah.
So, every single time the company requests or decides that we're changing our roadmap, it's no different than products roadmap. There is a give and a take and a pro and a con and an impact.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can steal all the resources directly from product development. And if you're within a tech company, obviously that's already familiar with these things.
Yeah.
Plus, right?
Yeah. It really, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look, you and I could do this all day. We've done it all night before, and I just want to say before we jump to Q&A, like, thank you so much. I think for the folks that have attended, an introduction to you is probably a really enjoyable experience, and I'm sure Shannon will tell us all this. But if you are thinking about strategy and you're thinking about content and you're trying to figure out how to build a plan and you want some help, Doug is an exceptional partner there. So I can't recommend him enough. And I'm sure Shannon will give us ways for you to reach out to him if there's something you think he can help you with, but highly recommend that you do that.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And one thing I'll just say really quickly. Yeah. At Fresh Academy, we especially love the strategy. We love to engage at first in strategy because I think that's where a lot of stuff can happen. But we are a full soup to nuts company that offers engagement on any level of creating curriculum, manipulating platforms, et cetera, et cetera. And we love to partner with teams and kind of actually just be your on deck or bench players who can help, add capacity to your team necessarily in lots of different ways. So yeah, happy to chat with you all. Many of you might in fact be in these conversations right now talking for budget for next year, or hopefully those have already passed and you've gotten through that.
I love Pam's question, by the way, Shannon. We
Right.
should
Well,
talk that out.
yes. So I know we're coming up on the hour here. And so my quick ask is that as folks leave, right, Zoom sends you a little survey. It'll take you less than a minute to fill out, but Underscore is a series for you. So you want to know what would be useful and relevant to you all to learn about. We're going to take Pam's question, which is a great question. It's really on like obstacles to these things. How do we get access to those? Like, how do we work with other teams to get access to measurement? But I'm also going to, before we answer that question, let you know that next month we're going to be talking about doing more with less, because this is something that we've all been asked to do. And kind of to Doug's point about, teams don't have as much budget or head count, and that's not just education, it's just kind of across the board. So we're going to talk about, okay, in light of that reality, how do we actually become more efficient? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to throw this question to you, Doug. So getting business outcomes requires reaching outside of your silo, and often there is resistance to that because of time, cost, and security. How have you overcome this?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. I think, yeah. So one, I would encourage you to talk to the people you wouldn't think of. So for instance, product teams. Talking to a product manager is often not a thing that most education leaders would think to do off the bat. But I'll tell you that there's a lot that would actually be super interested to talk to you. So I think the way to think about this is less of an org level, because your org might be like, yeah, no, you have no reason, you have no business necessarily talking to these people. But if they're within your office, I find these people, find out who they are, and find out how you might be able to access them, right? And that might be just be like, oh, let's have a coffee and chat about some things. Also, when you're kind of doing your world tour with yourself, just talking about education aspects, especially if you have a local office, this is a really great place to see people who might just have sort of a passion about it on some level. Like finding a data analyst, for instance, who's just kind of interested in looking at these outcomes. I will say, from a data analyst standpoint, what's going on in terms of attribution and education, wonderfully challenging problem. Like, talk about an amazing thing to try to tackle as a data. If you like hard problems, we're here. and I think it's a really cool way to frame it. Yet we actually have a lot of really neat new data, and I think it's actually a really big frontier for education right now. So yeah, so try to open up those, again, the formal channels of your company might not necessarily openly, sort of direct this, but if you might talk to your manager or to other people around who might be able to give you, just even have a coffee and sit down with the people, that's where often, yeah.
Pam, I'll give you as we sort of wind down a case study type example. So I worked with a company, the education team was new, they launched a new initiative. They got through the first year. I mean, this is all science at the end of the day. They had a hypothesis. The hypothesis was that the individual users that completed the certification spent more money. That was their hypothesis, and it was all anecdotal. They were talking to, to customers, and customers were telling them things that made them believe that. What the initiative owner couldn't get across the fence was individual user spend. The company was like, we're not giving you that. Like there were people that held on to it, and they were like, like that's just, it violates all the procedures and the policies and whatever, and you can't have it. No. And so instead of just letting the no go, she was really moving towards demonstrating the at least the revenue driving aspect of this. She came up with an idea, and her idea was, I don't need the individual user spend. I've got a group of users that we've sort of segmented off. I know which ones have completed the certification. She took the group, the users, the individuals, and she went to the same team and said, can you give me an average of spend increase over the last year for these users? And what she was able to do at least was correlate, look at the average increase in the spend for the users that were in that group, and go back to leadership and say, well, we can correlate this increase in revenue. People who completed the certification, on average, were likely to spend X% more. And that's all she needed to do to be able to demonstrate the impact.
Yeah. Also shared like this. Actually, this article I'm just looking through that Shannon just shared is great. It has a lot of aspects of this. Shared metrics across other teams. Another really great avenue, right? Another team might have a lot of really great analytics resources that you don't necessarily have locally. Why not share a certain, deliverable? And that also is a great thing to see in education. Another way to kind of advance your impact, both like you can kind of visually see it, as well as like obviously it creates pivot points between your team, or connection points.
Awesome.
Yeah, they piggybacked on work that had already been done. So instead of a net new project, they were kind of building off of something that had already been done, which, Doug, to your earlier point, like you're only going to find that out if you've been talking to other teams and understanding what they're doing and how they're measuring. But this does bring us to the hour. So thank you everybody who has come, who has stuck it out, engaged in the chat, asked questions. We hope this was helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. And you can also find the recording in your inbox. So yeah, with that, happy holidays, happy new year.
Happy holidays. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Doug. Thank
Yeah.
you. All right. See you. Okay, bye.